It began with a warning, a quiet sentence spoken in 2024 by Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré. When leaders forget their people, the streets will remind them. At that moment, few paid attention. The cameras turned elsewhere, the diplomats applauded politely, and across the continent, presidents returned to their comfort zones. But that warning was never just for Ouagadougou. It was a message for every African capital balancing between promise and collapse, between silence and revolt. Last week, that silence finally broke. In Tanzania, the spark ignited. What began as calm demonstrations after the 2025 elections spiraled into unrest that gripped Dar es Salaam through the night. Flames rose across the skyline as the government declared a curfew at 6 p.m., and by dawn, the internet had vanished. According to NetBlocks, Tanzania's online connectivity plummeted by nearly 74% in just over an hour. Official reports confirmed 2 dead, a police officer and a young civilian, and more than 120 people injured, according to hospital data. But this story isn't only about one violent night. It's about something deeper, the slow erosion of trust between a government and its people, and a leader who ignored a warning written clearly in history. When Samia Suluhu Hassan took power in 2021, she carried immense hope. The world celebrated the first female president in East Africa since Liberia's Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Calm, composed, diplomatic, she promised healing after the sudden death of John Magufuli. In her first address, she vowed that no Tanzanian will ever be silenced again. The newspapers reopened. Exiled opposition figures came home. For a brief shining moment, Tanzania felt renewed, like democracy had rediscovered its heartbeat. But reform in Africa is fragile. By 2023, familiar shadows returned. Critics disappeared quietly. Public rallies were canceled. New laws blurred the line between dissent and disorder. And as the 2025 elections approached, the opposition party Chadema announced a boycott, calling the process predetermined. Still, the government pressed ahead. When results came, the ruling CCM claimed its 7th straight victory since independence. But this time, the people did not believe it. On October 27th, protests erupted in the heart of Dar es Salaam. Tear gas filled the air. Police stations burned. And then something historic happened. The army did not move. A senior Tanzanian officer, speaking anonymously to DW Africa, said, "We received the order to deploy, but we waited. Not every command deserves a bullet. That hesitation changed everything. For decades, African regimes have relied on the military to silence unrest. From Cameroon to Chad, presidents stayed in power because soldiers obeyed without question. But in Tanzania, that chain finally cracked. The army's refusal to shoot gave the streets courage. By midnight, the city glowed orange with firelight. Thousands filled Uhuru Street chanting, "Nataka haki, sio hofu." We want justice, not fear. And in those voices, Traoré's warning returned to life. Because what he said was never prophecy. It was a pattern. Across the continent, in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, and N'Djamena, history had already shown the cycle. Governments that silence their citizens will one day face them. When Ibrahim Traoré spoke of sovereignty, critics called him idealistic. Yet his approach was pragmatic: empower the youth, reform the army, and listen before anger turns into fire. Tanzania could have learned from that. Instead, its leadership repeated an old mistake, confusing obedience with order. President Samia's advisors believed protests would fade once the internet was cut. But the opposite happened. VPN traffic surged over 400%, digital rights groups reported. Within hours, videos of burning buses and fearless students flooded Telegram, and one clip stood out. A 22-year-old woman named Nima, shouting in defiance as smoke filled the street. That video reached 2 million views in a single day. That is how revolutions sound now, not through gunfire, but through Wi-Fi. Across Africa, reactions came swiftly. In Burkina Faso, Traoré, speaking at a youth forum, simply said, "Some learn from history. Others prefer to repeat it." In Kenya, opposition figures warned that what happened in Tanzania could spread across the region if governments kept ignoring the frustrations of the young. In Mali, civic groups hailed Tanzania's soldiers as brothers of conscience. Western capitals issued cautious statements. Washington urged respect for free expression. The European Union called for calm. But inside Africa, something deeper shifted. The sense that the old political order, built on fear, hierarchy, and control, was beginning to fracture. Because what unfolded in Dar es Salaam wasn't just another protest. It was a moral reckoning, a people asking whether leadership still meant service or simply power. Tanzania, once praised as a model of stability, suddenly looked like every other nation where patience outlived promises. At Muhimbili Hospital, doctors worked through the night. One physician told reporters that half of the injuries weren't from bullets, but panic, stampedes, tear gas trauma. Among the wounded was a 16-year-old boy who said quietly, "I just wanted to see freedom outside." Families searched for missing loved ones as soldiers stood unarmed, confused, conflicted, unsure who the enemy was. A generation raised on digital connection now faces the same question their parents asked decades ago. Who truly owns Africa's tomorrow? The leaders or the people? Data from Afrobarometer's 2025 report paints a stark picture. 68% of young Africans say they no longer trust national elections, and most believe real change will come not from governments, but from networks and movements outside the system. And that new outside, for this generation, is not the West, it's the Internet itself. Economists are now warning that Tanzania's unrest could shake the heart of East Africa's economy. The corridor linking Dar es Salaam, Mombasa, and Beira carries almost $48 billion annual trade. If transport halts, fuel and grain prices will surge across 5 nations. But beyond economics lies symbolism. In African diplomacy, perception is power. For years, Tanzania stood as a bridge between the West and the continent. But bridges collapse when both sides pull too hard. China has nearly $11 billion invested in Tanzanian infrastructure, from the standard gauge railway to Bagamoyo port. Now, those projects hang in uncertainty. If the crisis deepens, Beijing may freeze spending while Western donors suspend aid. In that vacuum, a new model is emerging. Alliances like the AES bloc of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, built on self-reliant governance and regional sovereignty. For some, that represents hope. For others, fear. Look north, and the pattern repeats itself. Cameroon, still under Paul Biya's long rule, locked in conflict. Sudan shattered by generals who refused compromise. Yet, in the Sahel, despite sanctions, nations such as Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are sketching a new path, one where sovereignty isn't a slogan, but a system. What ties all these moments together is a single truth. People will endure hardship longer than humiliation. That's what Traore meant back in 2024, the day Africans stopped fearing their governments. Everything changes. And that day, it seems, has arrived in Dar es Salaam. Tonight the city is quiet. Shops shuttered, streets empty except for the hum of generators and the distant rhythm of the Indian Ocean. Everyone senses that this calm won't last. President Samia Suluhu Hassan now faces a decision that will define not only her legacy, but Tanzania's future. She can choose dialogue, the humility to listen, to open channels, to rebuild trust. Or she can choose control, the path that has destroyed leaders before her. History has shown the cost of deafness. In Cameroon, decades of paralysis. In Sudan, protests that turned to war. Tanzania still has time to choose differently. If she truly listens now, she might discover her people are not her enemies. Across Africa, this moment has grown larger than any single flag. From Dar to Nairobi, Lagos to Accra, young Africans are united by one question: why must leadership always come at the expense of listening? The continent's median age is 19. Its average president is 63. That gap isn't just generational, it's philosophical. One side dreams in possibility, the other governs in memory. Traore's rise, for all its controversy, symbolizes something new, leadership that speaks the language of the street, not the palace. Whether you admire him or not, his message is reshaping minds. Sovereignty is not isolation. It is accountability. And that is the lesson written in smoke across Dar es Salaam's sky. A reminder that authority without empathy collapses. While Tanzania trembles in uncertainty, there is one nation that has walked through similar fire and emerged stronger: Burkina Faso. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré took power in 2022, his country was on the brink. Over 40% of the land lay under militant control, millions displaced, foreign troops dictating security policy. 3 years later, the numbers tell another story. According to Burkina's Ministry of Defense, the state has reclaimed nearly 80% of previously lost territory. More than 22,000 local volunteers now serve in the Volunteers for the Defense of the Fatherland units, protecting their villages side by side with national troops. Attacks that once struck weekly have dropped by more than half. Instead of waiting for aid, communities are rebuilding schools, irrigation systems, clinics, with local materials and collective labor. Economically, the shift is visible. In 2024, the government began refining 200 tons of gold domestically each year, ending decades of raw ore export. Textile cooperatives in Kudugu employ 5,000 youth, and solar microgrids now power 300 rural clinics. Even under sanctions, food production rose 12% through student-led mechanization programs. But the deeper transformation is spiritual. For the first time in generations, Burkinabe youth speak of sovereignty not as a slogan, but a practice. Universities host civic forums where students debate policy with soldiers and ministers in the same room. The once mocked phrase, Faso First, has become a daily creed, that dignity is a nation's first resource. International. Observers who once doubted the movement now acknowledge. A new social contract forming in Ouagadougou, one built on sacrifice, participation, and trust. Traoré's message, that independence is built, not granted, resonates far beyond his borders. For nations like Tanzania, it stands as evidence that reform is not fantasy. Burkina Faso proves that when a leader listens before commanding, citizens answer not with fear, but with faith. And in today's Africa, faith may be the rarest and most valuable currency of all. When the curfew lifts and the internet returns, Tanzanians will wake to a changed country. Some will rebuild, others will remember. But across the continent, leaders will be asking themselves a single, uneasy question. Did we ignore the same warning? As the proverb says, he who refuses to hear the drum must dance to the thunder. President Samia Suluhu Hassan still has a choice. Before that thunder arrives, before Africa once again stands between fear and freedom. If you believe Africa deserves dignity, press like before you go. Share what question you would ask Ibrahim Traoré below, and subscribe for the next Africa briefing before the headlines change. Because, as Traoré once said, when truth is delayed, it does not die. It only gathers.